Howdy y'all, this is the first of two videos that's covering the Chapter 5 information about fallacies, and we have it divided into two. One video talking about the fallacies of relevance, and the other talking about fallacies with unacceptable premises. Okay, so as this is the first video, we're just going to start with a definition of a fallacy. So fallacies pretty straightforward. It's just an error in reasoning. So it's a bad argument that someone is making, or it's somebody who is believing something for bad reasons, right? So they are convinced by a bad argument is a fallacy. So what we have in this chapter is basically a list of some of the more common types of fallacies that sort of people make, and we give names to those. So we have ad hominem and appeal to popularity and appeal to emotion. So all of these are pretty common mistakes that people make when reasoning, and so we're going to go through some of those types. So Vaughn in Chapter 5 divides this sort of list of fallacies into two categories. So the first category, which we're discussing in this video, is fallacies with irrelevant premises, and the second category are fallacies with unacceptable premises. So we'll cover those five in another video later on. Okay. Before we move on to talking about these fallacies, I want to just sort of get across sort of the idea that when you sort of start to learn these, sort of to bear in mind that it tends to be sort of easy to recognize fallacious reasoning in others, and especially with people with whom we already disagree. So if you're just sort of looking for a reason to not listen to somebody, chances are you'll be able to sort of notice when somebody's making a fallacy, which is kind of problematic, because what we care about, or what we should care about, is our own sort of fallacious reasoning. The sorts of mistakes that we make in our reasoning, and so the trick is to work on ourselves, is to think about when it is the case that we are subject to this kind of fallacious reasoning. So the question is just sort of, or the admonition is just to sort of be on guard. Don't worry so much about other people's inability to think straight. Worry about your own. So let's start with this idea of sort of irrelevance. So a fallacy with irrelevant premises is one where the argument has a premise such that even if the premise were true, it tells you sort of nothing about the truth of the conclusion. So irrelevance is that there's no connection between the truth of the premises, or the premise, and the truth of the conclusion. So the premise could be true, but it doesn't do anything to sort of make the conclusion true. So that's irrelevance, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Every one of these examples is a situation where what we're sort of worried about is a premise that's irrelevant. So here's a pretty sort of obvious example. Suppose I make this sort of argument for a day of the week, and I'm trying to argue that sort of today is Monday, and somebody asks, well, how do you know? And I say, well, the sky is blue. The sky is blue, therefore today is Monday. That is a really unhelpful argument. There's nothing about the color of the sky, blue or not blue, that tells you anything about what day of the week it is. And so in this sort of scenario, it should be pretty obvious that the premise here, the sky is blue, is irrelevant to the conclusion. Now that said, some of the fallacies that we're going to discuss are those that have premises that, to a lot of people, including ourselves, right, at least in some situations, are going to seem relevant, right? That's how they sort of trip us up. is that has this sort of feeling of relevance, or it psychologically, we are drawn to sort of think that they're relevant. But upon analysis, it should be realized that it's actually sort of not relevant, and thus you shouldn't believe anything on the basis of it. We're going to talk about different types, but I should sort of note here that the types here are not super rigorous. They're not exclusive, and they make reference to kind of different kinds of errors, and it's possible for an argument to sort of err in multiple ways. So it could be that you're in a situation where you have something that in one way of thinking about it looks like one kind of fallacy, and in another way of thinking about it looks like another kind of fallacy. That's entirely possible. These are pretty sort of informal distinctions, and so there'll be some overlap in some cases. All right, so the first fallacy that I want to talk about is red herring, and you'll notice that I'm not following the same order that Vaughn uses in the chapter, but some fallacies I think need to be sort of discussed first. And red herring is one of them, because red herring is so general. So this category that we're discussing is arguments with irrelevant premises. In a lot of cases, we're talking about like sort of specific kinds of irrelevance. But with red herring, it doesn't really matter, right? With that red herring, it's defined as just the intentional use of any sort of irrelevant information to distract from the real issue. So the red herring is more an issue of being distracting than it is a particular sort of kind of irrelevance. One place that you may have heard of sort of red herrings being used are sort of murder mysteries. Murder mysteries always put some information in there that looks like they're relevant, right? It looks like that they're sort of clues to the killer or the person who did the crime or whatever it is. But oftentimes it turns out to be sort of irrelevant. So that's the idea, is that it's true, but irrelevant, and it's sort of being deliberately used to sort of throw people off. So it doesn't matter what kind of irrelevance you're using, right? So you could use a type of irrelevance that's sort of covered by some of these other fallacies. So maybe you're appealing to emotion as a way to be distracting, or appealing to tradition or whatever. It doesn't really matter what it is. What matters, or what makes something a sort of red herring, is that it's sort of intentional, that the person who's doing it is sort of deliberately trying to distract the person sort of asking them questions or questioning their beliefs by sort of bringing up stuff that's irrelevant. So here's an example. So suppose this starts with sort of a reporter asking a senator a question. So a reporter says, "Senator, do you think that the president was right in downplaying the dangers of coronavirus?" Right. So that's the issue here, right? Is the president right in downplaying coronavirus? And suppose that the senator, he just doesn't want to talk about this. Will instead just sort of come up with some distracting thing that is irrelevant to the question. So the senator says, well, that information came from a gotcha journalist, and I don't support gotcha journalism. So just completely sort of changing the subject to whether or not gotcha journalism is a worthy thing to think about, and have completely sort of moved away from the question at hand. And then presumably the senator was doing that deliberately, right? So that makes it sort of the red herring. So you're bringing up information that's irrelevant, but doing so knowingly to distract from the real issue. All right, so here's an example of something that tends to be really distracting to people, which is emotions. So appeal to emotions, whether sort of deliberate or not, can lead us to sort of error. And sort of what we're worried about is arguing or believing that something is true based on an emotional but nevertheless irrelevant premise. And this is kind of well known that uh, emotionality can cloud our thinking, and so it can cloud uh, the obviousness of the irrelevance of some piece of information. But we should say, though, and this is kind of important, not every piece of emotional information is going to cause you to make this mistake, right? So just because something is emotional doesn't mean that you will appeal to emotion, that you will engage in this fallacy. But nevertheless, the fallacy that we're discussing are situations when that happens, when the emotionality of something clouds the irrelevance of the issue at hand, and so this can be sort of done with any sort of emotion, but some of the specific ones get names. So if you're kind of relying on compassion, we call that sort of appeal to pity. Anger can lead to something called appeal to outrage or scapegoating. Fear, you could use scare tactics on somebody. Or if you just want to boost someone's ego, you can engage in flattery, which is we call sort of apple polishing. So all of these things are sort of examples of situations where someone might make a mistake. So again, bear in mind that just because something is emotional doesn't mean that it's irrelevant. But what we're looking for are situations where that is the case, that this emotional content is being believed um, to be relevant, and probably due to the fact that it's emotional. So I have here the picture from the very famous sort of Sarah McLachlan animal rights video, which, if you've ever seen it, has a bunch of sad pictures and video of sick puppies and kitties. And you have to be careful with sort of imagery like that because it might lead to sort of a mistaken reasoning. And so here is an example of what a mistaken reasoning would actually look like an appeal to emotion fallacy. You watch this video and you say to yourself, "Oh, those sure are sad pictures of puppies and kitties." So it must be that organization that showed them to me deserves my money. So as sad as those sort of pictures are, it would be an error to think that just from those pictures that the charity is legitimate. You should work look very hard to like who is asking for your money, and only then should you sort of draw a conclusion that they're sort of deserving of your money, right? Just because you see some sad pictures of puppies and kitties doesn't mean that the charity is a legitimate charity. Now, that said, in the case of the Sarah McLachlan video, you can do some research and find out that she's shilling for an organization called the British Columbia Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So she is it's a Canadian charity that does use its money for animal welfare purposes. So you could do a little bit of work to kind of figure that out. But the commercial itself doesn't sort of tell you anything, right? The commercial itself just shows you puppies and kitties. And again, it would be irrational to conclude that it's a legitimate charity just based on those images. Okay, so I want to move on to what I call sort of the fallacies of criticism, and that captures sort of three fallacies here. So there's the genetic fallacy, appeal to person, which has the fancy Latin name of ad hominem, and straw man. The fallacies of criticism occur when someone is trying to argue that someone else's position is false. So this is where the criticism element. So it occurs in this context where you're trying to throw some doubt on the position that sort of someone else has. And so this kind of looks like we're like the testimony situation where sort of you have this other person who's sort of arguing or saying that sort of P is true. And, bear in mind that when we talk about sort of testimony, we have to, it is sometimes reasonable to believe what X says, or to believe that what X says is true on their say-so because they're an expert and because they're being sort of sincere. But this is not that situation, right? This is sort of arguing that something is false based on some irrelevant information about X, and so that's the fallacy that we're sort of worried about, right? So if it's fine to sort of worry about the credibility of a source, but it's not okay just to sort of say that it's false because you don't like the source, and that's kind of what we're thinking about here. If you do want to argue that P is false, and again, bear in mind that a not credible source doesn't tell you that P is false. What tells you that P is false would be evidence that P is false. So if you find yourself in this sort of situation, and you want to criticize it, then what you ought to do is argue the thing on its merits, right? If there's reason to believe that P is false, then present that information. Don't do something else. But unfortunately, it's easier, at least in the forum of public criticism, it's easier to criticize the source of the claim, right? To go after the individual or group of individuals who are making the claim, or to criticize some sort of caricature of the claim itself. So to turn the claim into something that's easier to fight. So in that first strategy, if you start bringing up irrelevant information, then you're going to be engaging in genetic or ad hominem fallacy. And if you go with the second strategy, you'll be engaging in the straw man fallacy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. But it is important to know that both of these strategies are typically fallacious, that it's usually the case that the information that they're bringing up is actually kind of irrelevant to the truth and falsity of P itself. All right, so let's start with going after the source. So genetic or appeal to person or ad hominem, whatever you want to call it. The genetic fallacy occurs when you bring up irrelevant information about the source of the claim to argue that the claim is false or true, right? So you might do sort of what we call a positive genetic fallacy, where instead of arguing against the claim, you're actually arguing in favor of the claim. And instead of bringing up negative information about the source, you're bringing positive information about the source. So that's possible as well. But that said, ad hominem or appeal to person is just a subtype of the genetic fallacy. So it's just a version of the genetic fallacy where the source that you're thinking about is a single person instead of a group or an institution or an era of time. And that is really all that distinguishes the two. I mean, the ad hominem is essentially just sort of a specific kind of genetic fallacy. So don't worry too much about drawing distinctions between genetic or ad hominem. They're very similar. But that said, there is a particular type of ad hominem that's a pretty common way to go after the source, and it's a pretty common way to just sort of bring up something that's irrelevant to the situation. So this is called tu quoque, which is Latin for you yourself, and it involves calling out somebody's hypocrisy in an attempt to discredit their ideas. So it's a type of ad hominem typically because you're usually calling out a person's hypocrisy, but I suppose it could be done at a more general level. But tu quoque is what it is. It's this charge of hypocrisy, and we should bear in mind that it has nothing to do with the truth of somebody's beliefs. So here's an example. So say your professor keeps talking about the dangers of binge drinking, but then you find out that last night he was arrested for a DUI. What does that tell you? Does that tell you anything about the dangers of binge drinking? No. That it still dangerous to binge drink, right? The fact that somebody who is talking about it isn't really sort of taking their own advice doesn't mean that what they have to say about it is wrong, right? It may feel like they've lost their sort of authority to talk about it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't sort of show you anything about the truth or falsehood of their beliefs. So again, this is an example of this kind of fallacy, right? That is just irrelevant to the truth of what we're talking about. That the professor is a hypocrite, right? Or the professor is, has lost his moral authority or her moral authority. All right. So straw man is the other strategy. Straw man is to go after sort of the claim itself. And instead of, so this is how it works, is that instead of criticizing the opponent's true position, that you instead sort of attack a ridiculous caricature of their position. So typically this is done because oftentimes their true position is sort of reasonable, right? And so that's difficult to attack. So it's much easier just to pretend that their true position is something ridiculous, and attack that instead. And this is a very, very, very common practice that people who don't really want to sort of engage in a debate about something will just sort of caricaturize their opponent's view in a way to sort of be dismissive, or to try to paint them as an evil person, or a person not worthy of discussion. So this happens a lot. So I got a number of examples. So person A here is going to be the person with at least, I mean, maybe not true belief, but at least, a belief that it could be held by a reasonable person. And person B is going to sort of caricaturize their view. So in this first example, person A says, I think we should have background checks for AR-15s and similar weapons. So that's that's not a crazy view, I don't think. And there are a number of reasonable people who hold this belief. But person B, who doesn't want to talk about that, will instead say something like, person A wants to take away our Second Amendment rights, right? They want to take all of our guns. So that, again, is not the view of person A, but nevertheless, that's the view that person B has turned it into. And so it's just irrelevant. Like, anything that you say about the caricature isn't really going to tell us anything about the initial position. Here's another example. I think biological sex is a real thing. Right, that's person A's view. Person B, well, A hates transgender people. Right, well, that's not the same thing. Having a belief about biological sex is not the same as hating a group of people. Person A, Black Lives Matter. Person B, A wants to erase white people, white genocide. Right, you hear that. That is also just not true. It's not the same belief. Person A, I think people should have the right to free speech, even if that speech offends some people. Person B, A enjoys hate speech. Again, just not the same thing. So it's a common enough practice that almost everybody does it at some point. So this is something that we really need to be sort of on our guard about. That just because somebody disagrees with you and has a view that you think is false, it doesn't follow that view is whatever messed up caricature that you can sort of come up with about that view. So we all have to be careful about straw manning our opponent's arguments. All right, so moving on. We're going to move away from the fallacies of criticism here and talk about some other sort of general fallacies. So ad populum refers to both the appeal to popularity and appeal to tradition. And I guess they're similar in some respects. Appeal to popularity is the fallacy of believing that the popularity of a belief is evidence for its truth. It's not, right? Just because something is popular doesn't mean it's true. So here's an example. Everyone says that the earth is round, and so it must be. Nope, that's a fallacious way to sort of think. Just because everybody says that something is true, it doesn't follow that it is true. So again, Hopefully that's obvious. Appeal to tradition is similar, but instead of the popularity of belief, we're talking instead about the longevity of a belief. So some people think that, if something has been around for a long enough time, then it's probably true, right? Or it works, or it's good, or something like that. So here's somebody who says, for thousands of years, people have used vitamin C to treat colds, so it must therefore be effective, right? That's not true. That's a fallacious way of reasoning, right? So vitamin C may be effective, but this is a bad reason to think that it is, right? This would be a bad argument. Okay, another appeal to something, appeal to ignorance and I have Ghost revisited here because this is a place where a bad argument for the existence of ghosts shows up. But appeal to ignorance is believing that the lack of negative evidence counts as positive evidence. And that's not true, right? Lack of negative evidence is just that. It's just a lack of evidence. And only positive evidence counts as positive evidence. So just because someone has failed to disprove something or failed to show that something is false doesn't mean that it's true, right? It just means that you're in an area where we don't know, right? Maybe there isn't any evidence sort of one way or the other. But only when you have positive evidence is it rational or reasonable to believe that something is true. And so this happens oftentimes in the supernatural discussions, right? That supernatural entities are, in fact, any entity is hard to disprove, right? You can't really prove the non-existence of something. But nevertheless, somebody might say that, well, no one has disproven the existence of ghosts, so therefore ghosts probably exist. This, again, it doesn't mean that ghosts don't exist, but this is just a bad reason to think that they do. What you need, and what I've always sort of just been about, is you need positive evidence, scientific evidence for the existence of these entities, and not fallacious arguments. Okay, a couple other fallacies here are composition and division. I won't spend a whole lot of time with these because they're not super common. But the composition fallacy is going in one direction, which is what's true about the parts is true about the whole. That's not always going to work. Here's an example. The team is made up of the best players, so the team will be the best. It's entirely possible to have a team made up of the best players and still not have the best team, right? They could be poorly coached or not get along or not play well together. So what's true about the parts is not necessarily true about the whole. The division fallacy goes the other way, right? What's true about the whole is true about the parts. That's not necessarily true. And here's an example. My phone is expensive, so therefore all of its components and parts are expensive too. Again, it's entirely possible that my phone has cheap components and cheap parts, and it's only expensive for some other reason. So again, just because it's true about the whole doesn't mean that it's true about the parts, but the fallacy is believing that it does mean that, right? The fallacy is believing that what is true of the whole is true about the parts. So you shouldn't do that, right? You shouldn't believe either of those things. All right, equivocation is kind of a fun one. It's a little bit harder to talk about this one in terms of fallacies, or excuse me, in terms of relevance, but nevertheless, it kind of works. So equivocation is built on this idea that, or not this idea, but this fact that some words have multiple meanings, right? That you can be sort of ambiguous with certain words. And equivocation occurs when you shift back and forth between meanings of the same word in the same argument. So the classic example of equivocation is this argument here. So you say, only man is rational, no woman is a man, therefore no woman is rational. It looks on, first glance that, well, look, this argument is valid, right? It has to be the case if both of those premises are true, then the conclusion will have to be true. It's just, a valid form. But the problem with that is, well, you're not really going to get, if you mean the same thing by man, you're not going to get both of those premises to be true at the same time. The only way to make both of those premises true is to actually mean something different with the use of the word man. So two meanings of man can be sort of a generic, maybe patriarchal generic for human, or you could just sort of mean something biological in terms of calling somebody a male. And so if by, you mean the sort of generic human by man, then premise two is false, right? So it's not the case that no woman is a human, and so what you probably mean to make premise two true is that no woman is a male. Again, just to try to think biologically here, right? If no woman is a male, then two is true, but one will be false, and so there's no way to kind of make both of these premises true uh, and keep the meaning the same. But if you change the meaning between premise one and two, then you no longer have a valid argument because you have different, what looks like a valid form actually turns out to not be. Um, okay, so we're going to end really quickly with two wrongs make a right. This one's, I don't know, I always feel like this one's kind of silly, but it occurs in situations of moral justification, and so it's fairly narrow in its scope, but this is just something that you've probably heard. Parents like to say this, is that two wrongs do not make a right. So to believe that they do is to believe that being wrong justifies sort of any kind of behavior in retaliation for that wrong. And for most people who kind of think about these things, it's not clear that being wrong justifies any kind of retaliation, right? So you may never be justified in retaliating, but nevertheless, a number of people believe that not only are you justified in sort of retaliating, but you're justified in going sort of over the top with your retaliation, right? So somebody cuts you off, and you're justified in sort of running them off the road. So this is, or honked at, my example is the driver honked at me when I didn't see that the light had turned green. So it's not even entirely clear that you've been wronged in this situation, but nevertheless, you conclude from that you must run her off the road. That is irrelevant, usually. I guess depending on what you think about morality. Okay, so anyway, this is just tried to keep this sort of brief here. Just wanted to go through the list and have my 2 cents about each thing on the list. I'll have another video coming that goes over the fallacies with unacceptable premises, but that's it for now.